My name is Rob Hartwell, and I'm here to talk about the storage of radioactive and nuclear waste at Yucca Mountain as part of my Thomas Edison State University Nuke 495 final project. I'm part of Team B. My team members are Gregory Sipek and Matt Speck. The areas I'll be discussing are the need for radioactive material, waste storage and disposal, types of radioactive waste for storage and disposal, United States government requirements for radioactive waste storage and disposal. So what is the need for radioactive waste storage and disposal? Well, radioactive waste is some sort of waste that emits some sort of radiation. For example, alpha, gamma, beta, or neutron radiation. The waste is produced by power generation facilities, defense-related projects, medical procedures, and industrial and educational research projects. So the greatest risk from the radioactive waste is the ionizing radiation emitted and the resulting increased potential for cancer. No threshold level has been established to ensure that exposure below that level will prevent the increased risk of cancer. Additional studies are in progress to evaluate a body's response to long-term low-level exposure and to short-term higher-level exposures. But right now, any exposure is considered to carry an increased risk of cancer. The overall average exposure in North America is between 3 and 3.6 millisieverts per year, depending on where you get your data from. And this includes exposure from the nuclear fuel cycle. A millisievert is an international unit of dose and is equivalent to 100 millirem. So you can see from the infographic the possible effects of radiation on the human body. So these effects range from the tolerable at the lower levels, which would generally be from naturally occurring sources or from medical procedures such as x-rays, all the way up to the potentially fatal level, which would be as high as 10,000 millisieverts, which could result in death over a couple of days. Also describes the organs that are affected and that the DNA in those organs can also be affected by radiation exposure. So DNA effects bring about another potential problem with radiation exposure, and that is genetic effects. So you can see from this picture the types of genetic effects that people are worried about. So having 8 toes on each foot is generally not desired. There is no evidence based on my looking at these pictures that these particular toes are the result of this boy's mother's exposure to radiation. But it is the type of effect that people are afraid of. So when you take the combination of the potential increase of cancer risk, you add to that the potential genetic risks for future generations, and then the portrayal of these risks to the public, often without adequate perspective and without additional training for the public for them to understand the risks associated with the radiation exposure, you end up with a general increased fear of anything nuclear. So this next graph demonstrates the total radiation of all types from waste nuclear fuel, and it's portrayed in becquerels per kilogram. Becquerels is another international unit of radiation, similar to a curie. And as shown from this, you can see that the radiation half-lives are displayed, and you can see that for the first 1,000 years, the fission products are the majority of the radiation that's emitted from high-level nuclear waste and nuclear fuel. Examples are cesium-137 and strontium-90. After about 1,000 years, transuranic elements produce the majority of the radiation, and that can go out to over 1 million years, as in the case of plutonium-242. So the perspective is this graph demonstrates the need for long-term isolation and protection of the public from these high-level wastes. The next graph is very similar, except that it demonstrates the ingestion radiotoxicity of these elements, and this would be in sieverts per ton of spent fuel. So what this one shows is that these heavy elements remain toxic to human populations for many thousands of years. So this also demonstrates the need to have sealed containments that will prevent introduction of water and prevent these heavy elements from getting into the water table and essentially making their way into the food chain and contaminating the human food sources. The next graphic you can see is just a simple demonstration of the basic radiation and shielding needed for the various types of radiation as we discussed. So we can see that depending on the source, that alpha particles and beta particles are easily shielded and don't pose much of a threat as long as you don't ingest them. Gamma rays, however, have a good ability to penetrate organic tissues, and overall we need to prevent unnecessary radiation exposure, and the types of designs for a long-term storage and disposal facility. So what types of material need to go into a radioactive storage or disposal facility? Well, the Nuclear Regulatory Commission has two designations. There's high-level radioactive waste and there's low-level radioactive waste. So low-level radioactive waste has three specific categories of A, B, or C, and it's based on the nuclides of concern, the amount of radiation that it emits, and the stability of the material, whether it's easy to contain. Low-level materials are not generally what we're concerned with in terms of a high-level rad waste facility, and they are generally compacted, shredded, turned into other types of materials, solidified, and buried in shallow containments. The materials that don't meet the categories for low-level classification are by definition high-level rad wastes. So our spent nuclear fuel and materials from processing fuel and from other research activities are the sources for our high-level rad waste. So we also need to store and dispose nuclear waste to ensure that we can prevent potential harmful uses of that fissionable nuclear material. So harmful uses would be anything that could hurt the public unintentionally or intentionally. So improper storage could result in uncontrolled public exposure. We could have this stuff stored in a field or in a warehouse or somewhere where it's not properly controlled, and have uncontrolled exposure to people that would have no idea why they were getting sick. You could also have terrorists or other such types of organizations retrieve this material and attach it to a bomb and potentially make dirty bombs. On a more sophisticated level, they could retrieve the fuel material, the spent fuel material, and process that material to remove the plutonium, and then they have nuclear weapons material. So to prevent the bad things that I've just discussed, the U.S. government has some requirements set forth for the control of nuclear waste. So the Nuclear Waste Policy Act of 1982 was a law that was passed by Congress to set forth requirements for safe long-term storage of high-level radioactive waste. So the United States has been developing, producing high-level radioactive waste since the 1940s, and until 1982 did not have a specific process or plan in place for how to control the material and what they would do with it for long-term control. So the primary tenets of the 1982 law was that a geologic repository would be developed for the radiological waste storage and disposal. So this law provided processes for selection of sites, congressional approval, presidential approval, and regulatory and operating responsibilities and funding. The Nuclear Waste Policy Act also required that the United States government should take possession of high-level radioactive wastes to ensure protection of the public and the environment, and that should occur by 1998. There was slow progress made towards site selection, and in 1987, Congress passed amendments to the 1982 law that eliminated the 3 site selection process requirements, and specifically designated Yucca Mountain as the only site to be evaluated and developed for construction of a geologic repository. The amendments also deferred the need to identify a second disposal site and permitted development of a monitored retrievable storage facility until after a permanent facility had been granted license for construction. This was intended to prevent the monitored retrievable storage facility from becoming a de facto permanent storage solution. In 2002, the Secretary of Energy recommended the Yucca Mountain site to the President, and President Bush approved the site for license application and continued construction. That set in place a large number of legal battles that to this day still haven't been completed. In 2009, President Obama eliminated all funding from the budget for continuation of the site's licensing process, except for any legal battles or legal discussions that were already in progress. And right now, the 2017 President Trump budget proposal includes money for the continuation of licensing procedures for Yucca Mountain. Well, that concludes my portion of the research project. I know that my other 2 teammates will continue on with the chronological continuation of the project. Please post any comments or suggestions, and thank you.